David is well known to many of you. He's the author of the Hedonistic Imperative, the Abolitionist Project, and has written many works around the ethics of animal suffering, and one of the co-founders of the World Transhumanist Association with Nick Bostrom in the late 90s or the early 2000s. Yeah, so he's been a fixture amongst transhumanist groups for quite a long time. So big welcome to David Pearce. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thank you, Adam. It's very good to be with you. Greetings from Buenos Aires. Yes, as some of you know, I've been a fixture of transhumanism for some time. I like to define transhumanism in terms of the three supers: super longevity, super intelligence, super happiness. My own particular focus long-term has been the problem of suffering, fixing the problem of suffering. And the only way I know how to do so, at least the only non-apocalyptic way I know how to do so, is genome reform. That is rewriting the genome, not just of humans, but also non-human animals, giving all prospective parents worldwide access to pre-implantation, genetic screening, counseling, and shortly CRISPR genome editing. But what's on a lot of people's minds most recently, particularly with the release of ChatGPT, is the possibility that this is all far too slow and long-term, and that we are on the brink of superintelligence, machine superintelligence. Indeed, there are some members of the so-called rationalist community, Miri, most particularly Eliezer Yudkowsky, who think, yes, that superintelligence is imminently going to solve the problem of suffering, but not by way of genome reform, but by essentially terminating humans. This is a so-called paperclipper scenario, not literally that AI is going to turn us into paper clips, but the functional equivalent. And this evening, this morning as it is for some of you, what I just briefly want to do is say what I think, well, rephrase that. Ask the question, are classical Turing machines and classical connectionist systems conscious subjects of experience? And if, and I argue that they're not capable of solving the binding problem, does this matter? What is the computational functional significance of phenomenal binding in animal minds? So I should say that before this chat, immediately before this chat, I was putting up ChatGPT folders on my website, starting with the motherlode website, headweb.com, which I started in 1996, asking ChatGPT questions and with suitable prompts, coaxing, in many cases, seemingly intelligent answers out of ChatGPT. But like other large language models, ChatGPT is a zombie. It is not capable of solving the binding problem. What is the binding problem? Two forms of binding we should consider. The first is local binding. Right now, you are perceiving not distributed neuronal feature processes firing, but instead individual perceptual objects. And for unexplained reasons, what naive neuroscanning suggests is just a pack of 86 billion odd membrane-bound, effectively decohered classical neurons is capable of generating phenomenally bound objects. That's local binding. There is also global binding, also known as the unity of perception, the unity of the self. One of the greatest feats, evolutionary feats in the animal kingdom has been the ability of animal minds to run real-time world simulations of the local environment. This is sometimes called perception. Naive realists believe somehow that they're able to penetrate directly through their skulls and access the external world. Naive realism isn't tenable. Instead, each of us runs this vast real-time world simulation populated by multiple dynamic objects, cross-modally matched, feature-bound. It is incredibly adaptive. And classical Turing machines and classical connectionist systems, ill-named neural nets, cannot solve the binding problem, in that, at least not on pain of strong emergence, which is akin to magic. To make this point, imagine if you replace the ones and zeros of a classical Turing machine with discrete micropixels of experience, and then execute the code. However fast the speed of execution of the program, and however complex the code, the upshot is simply a micro-experiential zombie, just patterns of mind dust that classical Turing machines, classical connectionist systems cannot solve the binding problem. How organic mind brains do so is a very controversial issue. Wasn't intending, unless people are interested, to go into some of my ideas on quantum mind, but it is worth stressing just how powerful phenomenal binding is. And the best way to glimpse just how computationally, functionally powerful phenomenal binding is to look at syndromes in which binding partially breaks down. Let's just consider, let's consider four. Someone with integrative agnosia cannot see individual perceptual objects. If you've got integrative agnosia, you can see jaws, teeth, a mane, but not a lion. And imagine how incapacitating that is on the African savannah. If you have the neurological syndrome of simultanagnosia, you can only see one object at once. And once again, imagine on the African savannah, imagine if you can't see the pride of advancing hungry lions, but you can only see one lion. Then there's cerebral akinetopsia, or motion blindness. People with motion blindness can see the lions in the distance, then a bit nearer, then a bit nearer, then almost on top of them. What they can't do is see motion. Those are all disorders of local binding, but to consider a disorder of global binding, consider someone with florid schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, the layman will sometimes know it as split personality. It's much better treated as a complete fragmentation of thought and perception. Somehow, and this is a very challenging issue, somehow organic nervous systems are capable of solving the binding problem and running the world simulation you're doing now, perception. Something like ChatGPT, essentially, it's not running a real-time world simulation. Its knowledge is out of date. And to pose any kind of notional threat to humans, you would need to essentially have robots that actually themselves are running real-time world simulations, i.e. perceiving, cross-modally matching the external world. And one thing that's going to become feasible within the next few years are neurochips. Essentially, anything that a classical digital computer can do, whether we're thinking of a classical Turing machine or a classical connectionist system, you'll be able to do with a neurochip. Transhumanists envisage post-human, transhuman, post-human superintelligence in different ways. There is the MIRI conception, the intelligence explosion, in which recursively self-improving AI, you get a runaway intelligence explosion, which may well be inimical to human interests. There is the Kurzweilian conception of the kind of singularity, which envisages humans essentially merging with our machines, perhaps some form of mind uploading too. And then there is this biointelligence explosion that I envisage, which combines all the benefits of traditional AI, which we are seeing now. I'm using the word traditional in a rather loose sense, but essentially everything that ChatGPT can do, you're going to be able to do, and more. And in addition, I think that we are going to be editing our own genetic source code and also genetically editing the source code of other sentient beings throughout the world. And I very much hope that our long-term goal is, as essentially enshrined in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, is good health for all. And the definition of health in the World Health Organization is extraordinarily bold. Indeed, it's beyond transhumanist. Health is a state of complete physical, social, emotional well-being. Now, that is more ambitious than even the most seemingly madcap transhumanists. And I, for example, urge a future super civilization based on information sensitive gradients of intelligent bliss. But that's not complete health. Complete health, as defined by the WHO, could only, I would argue, be achieved by some form of radical genome reform. And maybe sounding like now like a true genetic determinist. I'm not. There are all kinds of political, sociological, economic reforms that need to be instituted. Our most urgent ethical priority of all, I would argue, is getting the death factories shut and outlawed. I mean, one can say something like, oh, yes, I acknowledge a pig is as sentient as a pre-linguistic toddler, but how many people, when they hear something like that, actually think through the implications of what we are doing to millions upon millions of non-human animals as sentient as small toddlers? If people are interested, I could go into essentially the Abolitionist Project as I view it, but rather than my doing so, I thought perhaps we could have a little discussion on some of the points I've touched on so far, because clearly the claim that computers are never going to wake up and that there are certain computational tasks that are in principle impossible for a digital zombie to carry off, well, these are controversial claims.
Well, we've been surprised, most of us anyway, at the seeming capability of some of the deep learning, large language model, transformer-net AI that's around today. I mean, we've gone through a gauntlet of new sort of capabilities. We've seen AI solve board games like chess and Go, not only just solve them, but be able to sort of be trained to produce better Go and chess playing capabilities than humans have been able to program computers to do. Not just human players, but humans' ability to program computers directly to play chess and Go. And then there was Shogi and StarCraft, right? And now we have, more recently, some really beaut image generation. We've had protein folding sort of competitions won by AI, and now just, I mean, a lot of people here may have heard of GPT-2 and GPT-3 when it was out, but now it's gone mainstream. And it seems quite surprising how much can be achieved through just classic computation there, not using just normal von Neumann architecture, right? Would you be very surprised if a robot per se, without solving the binding problem, could escape a lion in the ancestral environment or on the African savannah without having a globally binding real-time world simulation?
Well, yeah, I mean, the only way that Mother Nature can evolve robots with a von Neumann architecture is first to evolve creatures like us that are capable of conceiving a classical Turing machine, implementing it, and designing, programming organic robots. That it's important to stress that that many problems that naively need phenomenal binding, there are workarounds for. I mean, take a game of chess, for example. Someone who has simultanagnosia and can only see one piece at once is at a severe disadvantage relative to a novice who can see all the pieces on the board. And a novice is self-evidently at an extreme disadvantage compared to a grandmaster who can just see a board in the way that you or I can't. But Stockfish or any other advanced chess program can blow even the most outstanding grandmasters out of the water without needing phenomenal binding. What tasks, on the other hand, essentially are impenetrable to classical digital zombies? Recall that classical digital zombies are ignorant of the entirety of the empirical evidence. And by empirical, I mean relating to experience. And one of the characteristics of humans in particular is that we spend a lot of time investigating, manipulating, talking about our own states of consciousness. So consciousness, phenomenally bound consciousness, has causal functional efficacy. And if one thinks of the whole enterprise of knowledge, knowledge isn't just of the natural sciences as traditionally conceived, in which life reduces to molecular biology, which reduces to quantum chemistry, which reduces to physics. Investigating knowledge also involves exploring a vast multitude of different state spaces of consciousness, as different as waking from dreaming. It's what psychonauts spend a lot of their time doing. It is cognitively extremely demanding. And for example, I do not know how one would program a classical digital zombie to investigate a phenomenon of which it has no understanding at all. So, I mean, that is one example.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. You brought up understanding and whether understanding requires phenomenal binding. That was interesting. But if we go back far enough, at least I think that if we go back to our great G to the power of 5,000 or whatever ancestors, if we go back far enough, they were relatively rudimentary, early precursors to our phylogenetic branching. And yeah, at what stage? We don't know at what stage phenomenal binding was stumbled upon in evolution. Do you think that it was there at the very onset? Was it part of the primordial soup or the whatever the ingredients, the abiogenesis ingredients were? Was it there at the very beginning? Didn't evolution stumble upon it at some stage?
Oh, well, what I was really hoping to do was, for the most part at any rate, avoid getting on to my somewhat idiosyncratic views on quantum mind. I'd much rather focus on the mystery. Some very smart people don't, as well as do, grok the nature of the binding problem. And when the first multicellular animals arose, particularly multicellular animals with primitive nervous systems, something quite extraordinary happened. By way of comparison, consider your enteric nervous system, the so-called brain in the gut. It's something like 500 million discrete membrane-bound neurons, a fabulously complicated information processing system, and yet, to the best of our knowledge, there is no phenomenal unity here. There is no subjective experience in your gut, whereas somehow primitive nervous systems, little clusters of cephalic ganglia, were capable of running phenomenal world simulations, not just patterns of mind dust, but somehow supporting phenomenally bound perceptual objects, miniature egocentric virtual worlds. And so, although I believe binding is ancient, how it is that supposedly decohered classical neurons are capable of generating these phenomenally bound world simulations, well, yes, something very strange happened in the late Precambrian.
Do you think, I mean, the reason why I ask is because it seems as though if evolution blindly stumbled upon phenomenal binding, then why wouldn't AI be able to do that if it thought it was computationally useful?
Essentially, classical Turing machines and connectionist systems can only work because of decoherence. That's the one. Imagine, yeah, think of Turing's original thought experiment. A superposition of two bits doesn't generate phenomenal binding. It is simply a bug in the program. Classical Turing machines and connectionist systems only function because they are effectively classical. Now, okay, I'll say it. What I'm arguing for is a version of quantum mind, not a dynamical collapse theory like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. I argue a case for the so-called quantum theoretic version of the intrinsic nature argument. The intrinsic nature argument solves the hard problem by making experience the essence of the physical, but the fundamental intrinsic nature of the world's quantum fields doesn't differ inside and outside your head. But even though that solves the hard problem, it doesn't solve the binding problem unless one actually considers the nature of the world, not just at the level of individual atoms and molecules, but at extraordinarily temporally fine-grained scales. And if molecular matter wave interferometry were to probe my brain at a sub-femtosecond resolutions, I think we would find evidence of neuronal superpositions of distributed feature processes. One of the characteristics of a quantum superposition is that it's an individual state. It's not a classical aggregate. Now, as I said, in this discussion, I wasn't planning to go into a discussion of quantum mind, but I was just stressing that on pain of so-called strong emergence, classical computers, however smart, are not going to spontaneously evolve binding. Their ignorance of phenomenal binding, unified subjects of experience, is architecturally hardwired, I would argue.
It seems as though like AI has done pretty good with workarounds so far. And, you know, we have to admit that you have been surprised at some of the capabilities that have sort of emerged. What sorts of capabilities? I mean, like, have you been surprised at that AI has been able to achieve in the recent years, and why have you found it so surprising, if you indeed do find it surprising?
I knew I was going to be surprised, and sure enough, I've been surprised, and so it is very natural. Like many. So
you're not surprised that you're surprised.
And that no, I mean, if we were catapulted 20, 50 years, let alone anything into the future, we would be blown away at what digital zombies could do. But what I'm making a very confident prediction. I mean, the first thing, if I, come out of the cryonics tank and I'm sort of confronted with this supposedly sentient robot. I mean, the first thing I would do is ask, are you sentient? Are you a phenomenally bound subject of experience? Now, if it said no, fair enough. If it said yes, well, I would want to inspect its architecture. And if it found extremely clever reasons to explain to me why I wasn't allowed to inspect its architecture, I would be all the more suspicious.
You brought up escaping lions as being like a litmus test for phenomenon binding. Would you be surprised then if Boston Dynamics had a lion escaping robot?
Once again, there are workarounds, and Yeah, the upper bounds to zombie intelligence are unknown, and that though I am, I say, very confident, I wouldn't like to assign a precise credence that classical Turing machines and connectionist systems are not going to become subjects of experience. Precisely what they can and can't do with sufficient ingenuity of programmers, I honestly don't know. And so, yeah, this is a very lame and unsatisfying answer. But yeah, I'm just going to have to say I don't know.
Fair enough. R2.
Hello, David. Hello, Adam. Hello,
Hello.
everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Yes, great. This might be delving too deep in the technicalities, but if we are to compare the computational powers of classical information processing systems, then we I'll lower my hand, sorry. Then we have to face the problem that just as in quantum computation, the computations aren't defined on classical bits necessarily. You can have inputs that are quantum states. You can have like outputs that are quantum states. Similarly, presumably, phenomenal binding and so on, to the extent it has computational power, which it probably has like immense computational power, in order to arrive at some sort of like even formulation of what we mean by comparing this, the power of phenomenal binding versus classical information processing, which is of course, actually implemented using quantum mechanical transistors and so on, but it is arranged so that it, is approximately classical, and there are all sort of error correction stuff and so on. But the model of computation behind it is based on binary digits and discrete finite structures and so on. But if we extend the notion of computation first to quantum computation, well, we already get incompatibilities in computation. A classical Turing machine can't prepare a quantum state simply because that's the formalism doesn't cover that possibility. And similarly, presumably, qualia computing introduces a sort of like an extended arena of computational complexity with possibly like very different sort of structures from what we are used to expecting from classical computing. So there's a problem of if we want to say that, for instance, phenomenal binding is extremely computationally efficient and certain things can't be done, well, a Turing machine can't produce a dot of red, presumably, but that's not because it lacks like certain sort of information processing capability. It's simply not something that the formalism has any room for. So I was wondering if you have anything to say about what sort of a computational complexity landscape you envision here. Is it possible to, for instance, put hard limits on certain things simply by, well, deriving some, I don't know, physical limits, cosmological limits, perhaps? So I don't know if it's like too early to say anything about that. Maybe we just don't have the framework in any way developed yet. But if we are to make sort of like these bounding arguments, like for instance, certain things are classically impossible to compute in a feasible time. We know this not because we have very detailed understanding of certain things, but simply because of there are physical bounds and certain.
I can't hear Arthur anymore.
I can't hear that.
Okay, I think he finished his question.
R2, forgive me, we've lost you. Yeah, it's essentially, I mean, clearly, even if we are quantum computers, quantum minds, as I argue, not in virtue of any new physics, but simply in virtue of existing physics, I said, which is an extremely implausible view. The reason that most physicists would discount it because of the effective lifetime of neuronal superpositions in the CNS, which can only be femtoseconds or less, which is intuitively the reductio ad absurdo of no collapse quantum mind. But anyway, one thing that is indisputable is that we are not universal quantum computers. This is very, very specialized. As to what futuristic, non-biological quantum computers could do, once again, I don't know. One thing I would say though is that I don't think we have any reason to suppose that futuristic non-biological quantum computers will support a pleasure-pain axis or any form of phenomenal binding of qualia with which we are familiar. I don't know what it's like to be superfluid helium. I don't know what it's like to be a fourth millennium artificial quantum supercomputer, but I don't think we have any reason to think that they will have a human-like spectrum of emotions or perceptual experiences. And in terms of the Abolitionist Project and creating life based on gradients of bliss, which has been my focus, I think that once we have reprogrammed the biosphere, phased out experience below hedonic zero, and engineered life based on gradients of intelligent bliss, we won't need to worry about the plight of either classical digital computers, classical connectionist systems, or quantum superminds, perhaps, because I do not think that they will have a pleasure-pain axis.
James Newton-Thomas.
Hi, David. Okay, so my question to you is very simple. If we stopped eating meat, or stopped eating pigs in this case, there'd be less pigs. Is it sort of philosophically better to have a life and then die than to not have a life?
I think if one is temperamentally an optimist, a life lover, then intuitively almost any kind of life is better than no life at all. And with varying degrees of conviction, I have known a small, I won't name names, a small minority of meat eaters essentially arguing that, factory farming it is a bit crowded, and slaughterhouses, yes, they aren't nice places, but nonetheless, as you say, most pigs would not exist if humans weren't breeding them. By way of opposition to this argument, I would highlight how the reason that non-human animals in factory farms are declawed, debeat, tail docked, castrated, and so forth is otherwise our victims in their desperation mutilate themselves and each other. Even in the wild, and nature can be pretty cruel, you simply don't find non-human animals mutilating themselves in their desperation. Factory farms and slaughterhouses are inherently abusive. And I mean, just as, by way of analogy, imagine if a sophisticated child abuser rich, privileged child abuser were to breed small children for abuse and were to somehow rationalize this by saying, well, they wouldn't exist if I didn't breed them or something like that. We would regard this as self-serving sophistry of the worst order. And likewise with factory farmed non-human animals, that ethical decency dictates that we should be systematically trying to help sentient beings rather than harm them. And so I would very much urge anyone listening to go vegan. I accept that moral advocacy has its limits, which is why I make the case for using essentially cultured meat to mass development, implementation of cultured meat. Cultured meat and animal products needn't be genetically engineered. This is really critical because a lot of people seem to imagine that it entails genetic engineering. This needn't be the case. Essentially it's our priority. It ought to be our priority to get the death factories shut and outlawed. There's this extraordinary poll, I simply didn't believe it, but apparently it's been replicated, that the Sentience Institute conducted a few years ago, in which 47% of Americans were allegedly sympathetic to the idea of closing slaughterhouses. It's this extraordinary, it's this disconnect. It's almost as if people imagine that they're eating roadkill. Life has its share of complicated, messy moral dilemmas. I don't regard meat eating as one of them. And so, yeah, I would just say stop eating meat and campaign to get
all right,
factory farms and sold out.
But David, would you then prescribe that to lions, for instance? Now, lions are carnivores, and if you watch a lion eat its prey, you'll notice one interesting thing is lions don't kill their prey; they will eat it alive. They will actually just start eating while the animal's still kicking and struggling. You know, Darwin had a problem with the wasps, etc., sticking their larvae in the insects. And nature's pretty red in Cluth and Tor or whatever it was. But would you see that we should then project our humanitarianness onto other animals?
Yes, I mean, just as lions practice sexual coercion, imagine if a rapist were to justify sexual coercion by pointing to the fact that it's endemic in the wild. But more directly to answer your question, yes, back in 2009, I think it was, I wrote an essay, Reprogramming Predators, that's essentially that we should be using gene editing technology to herbivorize obligate predators. I mean, there are alternatives. I mean, personally, I would be happy to see obligate predators, members of the cat family, non-violently phased out. But this triggers outrage from cat lovers. Therefore, one needs to look at alternative solutions, and everything from segregation to catnip-laced cultured meat to genome editing can be used essentially to herbivorize and veganize the rest of the living world. First, one would use pilot studies in self-contained artificial biospheres. One thing one would need to consider too, if one is going to herbivorize predators, essentially you're going to need cross-species fertility regulation, which involves presumably everything from immunocontraception to tunable synthetic gene drives, but we're not going to run out of computer power. This probably sounds fanciful right now, and the reason it sounds fanciful is that in a world where humans are systematically harming other sentient beings, the idea that we could be systematically helping them sounds fanciful, but the core ethic involved, whether it's Jainism, I sometimes speak of high-tech Jainism, or for that matter, the Bible, the book of Isaiah. If addressing a traditional or Christian audience, one can invoke the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah, where the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb. Yeah, the problem of predation is soluble, but only if we take an ethical decision that sentient beings shouldn't harm each other.
Jesus Christ had it into a fish, though. Anyway, thank you for that. I'll leave you there and let you answer some other questions. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
I must unmute myself first. Thanks for the questions, James. Sandstone, you're up next.
Cool. So I have a question about maybe the feasibility of a brain-computer interface device that could potentially expand our like empathy abilities, but so kind of extend our experience to feel what another is feeling. So there's applications just for like biological experience to feel what another organism is feeling, but potentially the same BCI to BCI device might be able to detect something like maybe like there's discrete experiences and if they're maybe phenomenally bound. It's very theoretical, but yeah, do you think that's maybe possible, or if it's useful? Yeah, if that makes sense.
How do we enhance and enrich our capacity for empathy, perspective taking, social cognition? Is it desirable? I would previously have just simply answered yes, but if one could glimpse even a fraction of the horrors of the world, one would go completely insane. So I think empathy needs to be used very sparingly. If one considers something like mirror touch synesthetes, someone with mirror touch synesthesia, if it sees you or at least their avatar of you in their world simulation, stub their toe, they will experience an equivalent stub of the toe too. And that is one way, essentially to enhance perspective taking. You don't get any malevolent mirror touch synesthetes. It would be like harming oneself. Other ways to enhance empathy and understanding of other perspectives, and I would argue that a full spectrum superintelligence would have the capacity impartially to access all first person perspectives and act accordingly. It's a very interesting case of conjoined twins that share a thalamic bridge. And if you, and though this is technically very demanding, but if it would become possible to set up reversible thalamic bridges, it would be possible for you to do a partial mind meld with other humans and indeed members of other species. In the case of doing a notional mind meld with a silicon robot, and though I say silicon, I'm not a carbon chauvinist, a classical Turing machine implemented in carbon would be a zombie, microexponential zombie, no less than it is in silicon. That if you were attempt to do a mind melding experiment with a silicon robot with a classical architecture, I would say that it would fail. That once again for these theoretical reasons. But in terms of what is the optimal level of empathy, perspective taking, compassion? I'm unclear about this for reasons I alluded to. Indeed, selectively, self-protectively, I try to stop myself being empathetic. It's incapacitating.
And just on that point, is there some kind of like first steps to this? Like if you get like a augmentation of like an arm, and you can start to feel it. I can imagine that's like extending your nervous system with greater sensory capabilities. And that kind of like consciousness extension with a synthetic body. I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but it feels that seems like quite an achievement technically.
Yes, I mean, there's a sense in which one never actually directly senses one's own body. All one can ever access is one's body image, the cross-modally matched, the somatosensory cortex, that when one is having a dream, one's having a lucid dream, one knows that one's own body, seemingly one's own body, and indeed the bodies of everyone who surrounds you, essentially, it's not you're directly accessing the world external to your skull. Essentially, this is a world simulation your mind brain is running. And people with phantom limb syndrome illustrate this, that one doesn't actually access one's external body.
Fascinating. Ashel, I think it's your turn.
Hey, nice to see you again, David. And thank you.
Hi, Ashel, good to see you.
I guess I didn't really have so much of a question, more so just a comment on something that was brought up kind of near the beginning of the talk regarding, kind of designing a sort of litmus test to see if an AI, might be sentient and might have phenomenal binding. It kind of seems like impossible in principle, or it doesn't seem like there could be, you could just think of an arbitrary Turing test that an AI could prove that it can, solve this test to the 2 or maybe greater than the capacity of a human. And I think maybe this was somewhat kind of touched upon with David's response to one of the questions regarding like, let me look at your architecture. Let me look at actually, how you are, I guess, like how your behavior is being instantiated within physics itself. I kind of see a lot of, I see the problem, some of the problems relating to the impossibility of say, like coming up with a test that would like tell us whether or not another being is sentient, relating to the fact that like a function kind of depends upon having a preconception of say the example that was given with regard to the escaping lions in the African savannah. If we could design an AI, or if we could design a robot to prove that it could perform this function, this doesn't tell us. I might have actually lost my phrasing. It doesn't tell us that it is. Actually, David, would you like to finish off my point?
As I said, this is an entirely informal discussion. I haven't got a set talk and didn't have a set question. I don't regard this as somehow a purely philosophical problem. As I said, if someone claims that phenomenal binding is non-classical, well, there are tests that can either confirm or disconfirm this conjecture. In the case of something like binding, if one is designing a robot, one will need to design workarounds for an inability to bind, which isn't just going to spontaneously emerge. How, as I said, the challenge of actually designing I'm not a computer programmer. This is this enormous gulf between my knowledge of what a Turing machine is and my Windows desktop or what have you. The challenge of actually devising workarounds for this immense real-time world simulation that your mind is running right now, it's daunting, absolutely daunting. I wouldn't know where to begin. Sorry, that's a non-answer to your question, but it's.
No, I think it,
yeah.
I think it kind of led me to something that I was meaning to mention as well, as regarding like the evolution of sentience. Like phenomenal binding, as you said, is like it's super adaptive, and organisms evolve the capacity to represent our external environment explicitly using fields of qualia for a reason, because it allows us to more effectively pass on our genetic information and whatnot. It seems that relating to what I was saying before, designing a task proving that an AI could perform any given arbitrary function that we come up with as a litmus test for sentience doesn't this is like a very narrow conception of what sentience does, which is like saying sentience or like pain is being able to like respond to harmful stimuli. The valence or the hedonic axis is arguably a lot more adaptive than like just any narrow conception of like say a given function that we assign to phenomenal binding or to sentience. And so it doesn't seem like any test could really prove the deep adaptability, if that makes sense. But
I think any behavioral test wouldn't be able to. Can I add an extension to your question then? And that is, I think we seem to be so used to the idea that AIs are opaque and humans are opaque. We've got this skull around us. We've evolved for so many hundreds of thousands of millions of years, not being able to peer inside a brain and seeing the actual phenomenal binding happening, or the whatever it is that gives us this sort of world simulation ability. We can't just go in there, or maybe we will in the not too distant future. So we better get used to the fact that maybe we'll be able to peer inside our heads and see what actually makes our sentience tick. Do you think it'll ever be possible to create a behavioral test that is outside view, not the inside view of what's going on inside our heads or inside the programming of a computer, just to see from the outside whether a computer has sentience? Just just assuming that could spontaneously evolve or emerge this sort of ability. I know you don't think that's possible, but just like, you know, on the freak occurrence that it could possibly happen, and if it did, it would be a moral catastrophe if we were to ignore it. Is there any kind of behavioral test that could be done to check to see whether it has phenomenal binding or a sense of consciousness or sentience? And if not, what would we be looking for inside, underneath the hood, for an inside view of what should be there to detect it?
I mean, the kind of molecular matter wave interferometry experiment that I proposed in Schrodinger's neurons to test this. Interferometry is technically difficult and demanding, so are there simpler ways to do so? One simpler way, I mean, consider something like phenomenal color. There's a small little group of cells in the nervous system, destruction of which causes cerebral achromatopsia, essentially complete motion, a complete color blindness. And if one takes a kind of coarse-grained classical approach, it should be possible to replace your color processing neurons with silicon duplicates. And if this replacement is successful, then all the objects in your world simulation will have color seemingly painted on them, as is the case now. Whereas I would argue that replacement of your V4 neurons in the cerebral cortex with supposedly functionally identical silicon surrogates would actually lead to complete color blindness. I mean, that would be one way. And if, just to give another example, if the successor to AlphaDog or what have you were to start spontaneously seeking out digital pain relievers after you performed surgery or repair work on its bodywork, this would be extremely disconcerting. This would be a behavioral test. In practice, though, on ethical matters, I think one should very much err on the side of caution when it comes to operating on silicon robots. I don't think one needs to be thinking about digital painkillers or digital anesthesia, nor are silicon robots, and by silicon I'm using this as code. As I said, a classical Turing machine will work just as well if it's made of silicon. Yeah, essentially they are not going to start spontaneously emitting distress vocalizations. They are not going to spontaneously start seeking digital morphine or anything like that.
Well, what would it look like if we had a computer that was built from, I guess, biologically inspired hardware? You know, you said earlier that just because if it was made of carbon, it wouldn't necessarily be sentient. But if it started off as a computer made of carbon-based material, much like our biology, and then it started evolving itself, and it wasn't silicon, and it, you know, started to behave in some ways like it had sort of evolved a sense of pain or pleasure, what would you expect it to look like on the inside? What biological pathways, what biological logic gates, or whatever, what phenomena would you expect to see under the hood?
That's it. I do not see how it is physically possible. It would be a form of spooky, strong emergence that I am a physicalist, a monistic physicalist. Monistic physicalism might seem to be radically in conflict with idealism, but not so. It's possible simply to transpose the entire mathematical apparatus of modern physics onto an idealist ontology. This is the so-called intrinsic nature argument. But if one is a physicalist, one believes that no element of reality is missing from the formalism of mathematical physics, or more strictly tomorrow's mathematical physics beyond the standard model. And one also believes that all the special sciences molecular biology, chemistry, and so forth, reduce the chemistry. And assuming again that monistic physicalism is true, we need to do the same of phenomenally bound states of consciousness. And I know of absolutely no way to do so if it is the case, or if it's ever in future the case, that classical Turing machines or classical connectionist systems wake up. I mean, I said I can't rule this out in the same way as I can't rule out the possibility that, this is the example of Erich Schwitzgebel, German philosopher, if materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious. Even imagine if a genie were to tell you, or an oracle, that the United States is conscious. One would want to know how it is possible. The fact that 330 million skull-bound American minds might be individually conscious and can reciprocally signal to each other and can implement any, assuming they agree to cooperate, any computation you'd like. Nonetheless, if some kind of continental subjective experience switches on, this is spooky strong emergence. It's magic. And the reason that scientists, philosophers dislike intensely strong emergence is that if strong emergence is real, then essentially all bets are off. Anything is possible.
It just makes it really hard to describe how non-living, non-sentient matter came together and had a strong emergence of sentience at some stage in evolution. Or maybe it was all along, but only in the precursors to life and not elsewhere in the universe, not in the rocks, but only in, I don't know, the stellar nurseries that produced whatever it was that were the building blocks, the ingredients for life with sentience. It must have emerged somewhere otherwise.
Yeah, and this is the intrinsic nature argument, that consciousness is 13.8 billion years old. It's the intrinsic nature of the physical. But what makes organic mind special for the past 500 years, 540 million years, isn't consciousness per se, but phenomenal binding. The way that right now, all you've ever known is your own phenomenally bound consciousness, this vast, seemingly external world simulation, and your unified mind, unified consciousness. This is what makes animal mind special and differentiates us from plants, from rocks, from classical Turing machines, and the abiotic universe. Now, it is, of course, intuitively an extremely implausible view, but if one takes the common sense position that quantum field theory describes fields of insentience, then one faces the hard problem. The intrinsic nature argument, as it's known, it dates back via Russell ultimately to Schopenhauer, says that essentially physics doesn't say anything about the essence of the physical, of the mysterious fire in the equations. It simply accounts for the relational structural properties of matter and energy. We know fields are real from their effects, but physics is silent on the intrinsic nature of a quantum field. And Schopenhauer, and I'm putting this in modern terminology, Schopenhauer would put it like this, essentially turned Kant on his head. Kant famously said that we will never know the noumenal essence of the world. All we will ever know is phenomena. But there is one tiny part of the noumenal essence of the world, the fire and the field theoretic equations, that one does know, and that consists of one's own mind brain. And on this so-called intrinsic nature argument, yeah, we are completely typical. Quantum fields don't differ inside and outside in their intrinsic nature, inside and outside your head. But what makes you special while you're awake or dreaming is the way that consciousness is phenomenally bound, and non-psychotically phenomenally bound, into these insanely adaptive world simulations that you and I are running right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's not strong emergence if life taps into that, is what you're saying. It's not really emergent phenomena consciousness. It's really just tapping into the intrinsic nature of the physical, according to this model that you're talking about. But like, then you could just reword the question. Would AI not have to emerge new types of sentience that wasn't there before? But wouldn't AI, if it was built with the right architecture, be able to tap into the intrinsic nature of the physical? If it, like, for instance, read your literature, or, thought, hey, maybe there's something to this, I want more computing power, that's how to achieve my goals, let's do it. It dips one little toe in, finds out, wow, oh my God, this intrinsic nature of the physical is amazing. Let's dive right in, and then becomes really greedy for all that intrinsic nature of the physical and starts consuming it all. Right?
What is this kidding, primitive organic robot talking about all this stuff about consciousness? Yeah, it is in principle possible in one sense for a classical Turing machine to investigate the intrinsic nature of the physical, and that is to code for organisms, namely multicellular animals such as human primates, and this is indirectly, and therefore doing so will be able to actually access the intrinsic nature of the physical. But as it stands right now, a classical Turing machine, however implementation thereof, however behaviorally smart in some respects, is invincibly ignorant of all forms of empirical evidence, the nature of pleasure, pain, color, absolutely everything. And one wouldn't describe any person who didn't understand the second law of thermodynamics as intelligent, let alone super intelligent. And the same is true of the nature of consciousness, phenomenally bound consciousness.
Well, there must be some kind of physical architecture that an AI could build, theoretically, if it theoretically understood that there was something to this intrinsic nature of the physical, as a sort of antennae to tap into this. Why would a computer never do that? Why would an AI never, ever decide ever to do that?
That I'm saying that an extremely sophisticated digital zombie, far more sophisticated than today's toys, might, I suppose, though this is mind-boggling, decide to program the code for a module or an organism that was capable, like us, of experiencing the intrinsic nature of the physical and phenomenally bound states of consciousness. And but it would no longer then be a classical Turing machine or a classically parallel connectionist system. It would be a different kind of architecture.
So we'd have to categorize it in a different way. But how would we know? Yeah. How would we know that whether it had done this or not? That's the question, right? Would you look for an antenna poking out of the top of a computer, or would be something, some kind of like a architecture, some sort of physical configuration of atoms, or what would it be? Do we know what that would be? Have we got any ideas?
I will throw that question open, but a friend, I don't know, half jokingly recently was suggesting that I secretly thought that AGI was imminent and was going to turn us into the functional equivalent of paper clips, and that I was deliberately trying to sow confusion because I was a negative utilitarian and would secretly be delighted if the problem of suffering were ended so cleanly and elegantly. That doesn't answer your question, which I will throw open.
So I was wondering on this topic of maybe the implausibility of consciousness in synthetic systems. Are a lot of people kind of maybe wasting their time with like worrying about mind uploading and catastrophic risks, like catastrophic suffering risks, where AI is going to torture us, or virtual worlds where we're suffering ad nauseum?
Personally, yes. I mean, there is one S-risk I don't even like to discuss it. There is a single S risk I do worry about, but the standard S risks that are discussed, I'm extremely relaxed about. Yeah, I don't believe mind uploading is feasible, so I don't believe that your notional digital copy could suffer even if digital boiling oil were notionally poured over it. Well, obviously one needs to be cautious here because one listens to so many clever people talking so much nonsense about mind, then one ought to apply the principle of mediocrity, that the chances are I talk nonsense too. But if one focuses not on the philosophizing, but on the testability and critically the falsifiability, first thing to ask anyone with any theory of mind, consciousness, suffering is how would one test it? How would one experimentally falsify it? And if someone says, well, actually, no, it's not falsifiable, or waffles at you, well, life is short, it's probably not going to be fruitful.
Do you think what kind of S risks do you think are worth considering and worrying about?
Ooh, heavens. Well, as I said, there is one form I do worry about, but there are certain forms of agential S risk that one might conceivably increase by talking about them, and they would disappear if we essentially phase out the biology of suffering. And this is the approach that I generally take. Let's focus on getting rid of suffering experienced below hedonic zero. It's possible so long as one retains information sensitive gradients to preserve critical insight, social responsibility, intellectual growth. Sorry to dodge your question.
And just to clarify, did you dodge my question because it somehow might increase the potential of it happening, or?
Yes, I mean, well, I have, and if anyone digs, they can see the actual S risk I do worry about. I mean, in one sense, one feels incredibly self-important. It's not as though people are going to, but just as discussing some forms of X risk, if you're part of the X risk community, can actually increase their likelihood. The same is true with certain forms of S risk.
Just an extension to the S risk question, do you think S risk is more likely to emerge randomly, like the abiogenesis of life on Earth, or do you think a worse form of it could come about artificially or intelligently designed, some sort of like hell?
Well, I don't want to be all deliberately vague, but it is agential S risk that I worry most about, and the way to diminish and then eliminate them is, I think, via biological genetic means, makes suffering physically impossible and eventually inconceivable.
Sure.
Cool. Also just a quick, I guess, follow up on the mind uploading thing. So I guess if you identify with, like, I guess the algorithms that are being instantiated in your brain to create your self model, you know, like the set of rules that kind of like determine what inputs and outputs determine your response to everyday situations, then like conceivably you could upload your mind. You know, I could upload like a virtual Asher, and David could upload a virtual David. But I guess maybe the core of what you were saying, David, is that, like, you know, we wouldn't be able to, it's not like we have a soul, or we have like an irreducible essence that is intrinsic to like Asherness or Davidness that we would be able to upload and, like, I guess, achieve a sort of like longevity of self. Maybe you could, like, if you identify with consciousness, you are already every other point of the universe, even if your self model doesn't realize that it is, if that makes sense. So mind uploading would be possible, but it doesn't seem like we have a good reason to desire that, because it's kind of, it's not like our consciousness is coming with it, because if consciousness is intrinsic to physics, then our consciousness is already there, you know, like, Any thoughts on that, David?
And there's the ethical question: should we upload if it's feasible? But essentially what I've been arguing is that it is physically infeasible, that a prerequisite, precondition of mind is phenomenal binding. No phenomenal binding, no mind. Therefore, it is someone like the Age of M's Robin Hanson scenario is essentially completely infeasible.
Yeah, if you define a mind and like sentience or phenomenal binding isn't a necessary, I guess part of your conception of what a mind is, then it would be feasible. But yeah, I can see your point there. Yeah.
Yeah, and consciousness is all I've ever known directly. Everything else is inference and speculation. Now, it's very strong inference and speculation, I believe, but nonetheless, it's all I've ever known. And that the idea that one can have a mind without phenomenally bound consciousness, one is talking about something else entirely. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to conceive of minds as just kind of like, I guess, algorithms that are responsible for inputs, for processing inputs and outputs. So like, me identifying as Asher, you identifying as David, which could be like, if we're just looking at the behavior of a given physical system, that could, be instantiated, regardless of the substrate. It could be instantiated, without phenomenal binding. But yeah, probably this is just a conceptual kind of like difference we have.
Yeah, I think a lot of scientists, a lot of computer scientists may well regard consciousness as something like kind of akin to the textures of chess pieces in a game of chess, that you can implement in some sense the same game of chess in multiple substrates, and the pieces can have multiple textures, but ultimately the textures, what it feels like of consciousness, are essentially computationally, functionally irrelevant. But we know this can't be the case with consciousness, because consciousness has the causal functional power to inspire discussions of its own existence, which is why any form of epiphenomenalism, I mean, most scientists wouldn't use this fancy term, but what philosophers call epiphenomenalism, is not a popular position in philosophy. Something is causing you or I to have these discussions about consciousness, and by definition, it can't be causally impotent epiphenomena. So, though it's convenient to make a distinction between the causal structural properties of the world described by physics and qualia experiences, raw feels, essentially, somehow, the intrinsic nature of the physical allows discussions of the nature of subjective experience, such as the one we're having right now.
James Newton Thomas.
Hey, David, sorry. So you're signed up for Elcor, I believe. Is that correct?
Well, I started off signing up with Alcor. What I'm probably going to opt for is cryothanasia, essentially, rather than become senile and a mere shadow of my former self at the age of 75 or something. I would probably intend to have myself cryothanased. The reason I'll be doing so is not because I think post-human superintelligence would want to revive sentient Darwinian malware from a previous era. It's more I would feel a hypocrite not actually going through with what I advocate. Essentially, if one is a transhumanist who believes in phasing out biology of aging, it's almost cruel to tell older people that science is going to find a cure for aging, but sometime after you're dead. And so I think cryonics should be opt out, cryothanasia should be opt in, and one should set an example.
Okay, then if I know that cryonics, well, Elcor, I don't know if Elcor have it in their policy, but some of the people who do it, of course, can opt to say, yes, I want my mind uploaded. Do they give now documentation? I think I actually am a director, by the way, of Cryonics, Neural Archives Foundation in Australia. We do brain-only freezing, but we do it more for neural archives. But the question I put you is, if on that form it said, look, we can replace every single one of your neurons with a with a system that is functionally identical, would you take that option? Would you think that neural net, which is you, and with all those functionally identical?
I mean, candidly, this isn't just rhetoric. I think of myself as Darwinian malware. Malware, admittedly, that I hope naively or otherwise is a stepping stone to something better. But yeah, imagine you are advanced transhumans, posthumans, and you do have the technical capacity to reanimate archaic, primitive Darwinian malware from a previous era. Do you do so? And if you do so, what kinds of enhancements, or as they would see it, remediation, would one opt for? And although, of course, the matter and energy that was suspended in my case could be reconfigured into a post-Darwinian smart angel, it wouldn't be me. So yeah, there's clearly a tension between saying that I'm going to get plan to get cryogenized at 75 or what have you, and what I'm telling you now, that essentially I think I'm Darwinian malware, but so be it. Now, if one does take the option of going for either cryonics or cryothanasia, it leaves the decision to our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or transhuman, post-human superintelligence. It keeps their options open, shall we say.
Okay. All right, thank you.
David, we've been speaking a lot about consciousness. Let's talk about AI again. Do you think, would you be surprised if AI were more capable of prescribing ethics than the average human, or even the most, I guess, learned humans, the most philosophically versed, the Peter Singers, the David Pearce? Would you be surprised if AI started to prescribe a more moral stances, more ethical stances, more thought out ethical stances than humans?
Yeah.
And if so, why?
Just as
and why not?
Digital zombies can be far better mannered than many, possibly most humans. Likewise, I imagine they can spit out responses that are more ethical than most humans. It depends how they've been programmed or trained up. There's the question clearly of whether one is a moral realist or anti-realist. A lot of scientists would regard it as almost trivial that values are subjective, neither true nor false. I would take a value realist perspective that agony and despair are self-intimatingly disvaluable, just as bliss is self-intimatingly valuable. And yeah, there's no reason for me to think that I'm in any way special, and that a post-human superintelligence that could impartially access, imagine all possible first-person perspectives would act accordingly. In the case of a digital zombie, it could be programmed essentially to argue converting the world into hedonium, but equally into delirium, or sorry, delirium being matter and energy notionally optimized, for want of a better word, for pure misery. Yeah, I've been actually testing ChatGPT on what it thinks of hedonium, delirium, and such topics. But yeah, a lot will depend on what you think is the correct theory of ethics, if you believe there is any such thing as a correct theory of ethics.
Without a direct link to experience, without this self-intimating experience of suffering and bliss, would AI then, or any form of synthetic agent, be able to discover or make progress in ethics? Do you think progress in ethics can be made without a direct experience of suffering and well-being?
And there are some computation, some implementation challenges, in that if as I argue, we should be aiming to genetically reprogram the entire biosphere to have life based entirely on gradients of this. This is a tremendous technical, ethical challenge, and AI can certainly help in that respect. But in terms of actually making a substantive contribution to ethics, if zombie AI has no notion of the difference between pleasure and pain, that I find hard to imagine.
So you'd be how surprised on a scale of 1 to 100 would you be if AI started to make clear ethical progress in the theory of ethics itself without obviously having any sort of direct experience of suffering or well-being?
I would be surprised, but is one imagining that this is AI that is programmed or trained up, or is spontaneously, in the absence of any unified phenomenal self, actually devising a code of ethics? Yeah, I would be surprised, but that's not a vigorous argument, needless to say. I mean, I assume that, yeah, we're all going to keep on being surprised again by progress in AI. So if I appear to be being pretty cautious about, yeah, I am very cautious.
If you admit of the possibility that AI without phenomenal binding or a direct intimate experience of suffering or well-being could in principle make progress in ethics, would you advocate for that? Or would you not? Would you sort of agitate against it? And if so, why?
Well, one has to be cautious if one assumes that the values or utility function of artificial superintelligence align extremely well with one's own preference architecture or utility function. But an AI coded with a utility function of either classical or negative utilitarianism could presumably spit out consequences that most people would find wildly counterintuitive. Rather alarmingly, someone, this is just a tweet, was saying that they didn't think that AI should be programmed to its utility function to minimize and abolish suffering because it might draw an inappropriate conclusion, i.e. that sentience should be phased out.
If an AI came up with a rigorous argument without having direct access, the intimate experience of suffering or well-being, and it came up with a counterintuitive to you argument, but once you, initially it was counterintuitive, it appeared, but once you read through it and understood it, it seemed convincing. Would you disregard it based on the fact that it didn't come from an agent with direct experience of well-being or suffering? Or would you adopt it because you were rigorously convinced based on the merits of the argument?
I wouldn't trust my own judgment, and I would want to know essentially how it had been programmed or trained up.
Right. So you'd want to know the architecture of the AI. If you found that it didn't have any phenomenal binding going on or any direct experience of stuff, let's just say like it was like a completely transparent AI, like a Bayesian network, except it could learn, it was really super smart, and it could do all sorts of wonderful things, and it wasn't as opaque as a human mind or as a current state-of-the-art deep learning large language model transformer net or whatever. It was the type of AI whose model would be self-explanatory, although maybe very complex, but still self-explanatory and I guess tractable to human understanding. If it were the case that it came up with a really rigorous argument, you could see all the causal pathways in how it came up with that argument and the causal pathways in its argument. Would you then be convinced?
As I said, I simply wouldn't trust my judgment. So I would want to, understand the process by which it acquired its values and prescriptions.
Would you would you trust the consensus of experts if you weren't to trust your own judgment?
Yeah, one of the most valuable skills one can acquire in life is working out who the experts are in any given discipline and then cautiously deferring to their expertise.
What you need is an expert on experts, David.
Yes, exactly. So in the case of, something like aeronautical engineering, it's quite clear who the experts are and one defers to them pretty uncritically too. But in the case of consciousness or ethics, there are essentially no real experts, or not any experts with a proven track record of expertise. I'm very suspicious of people I regard as cranks when it comes to something like consciousness or binding. All the options are crazy. It's what Eric Schwitzgiebel christened crazyism. So yeah, we know all the options are desperately implausible. There are no real experts, as distinct from tenured professors and the like. So yeah, one has to do one's own investigating.
Is it physically possible? I mean, is time travel possible with like AR or with any other science?
Time travel?
In your opinion. Because this was about the future,
heavens.
so I thought it was about time travel.
Yeah. Well, I'm skeptical of time travel. Physicists do discuss the possibility of closed time-like curves. There is a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, the two-state vector interpretation, which can be combined with Everett, that makes causality an essentially symmetrical relationship, and what we naively call the future is as much causing the past as the past is causing the future. However, yeah, I'm really a skeptic about time travel.
Did you mention time curves? I missed that part. Did you say curves? Something
closed time-like curves.
Oh, yeah, time-like curves.
Yeah, time-like curves. Yeah, if you just imagine the surface of the globe that you keep on traveling one way, you would eventually come back to where you started. But essentially, I think all of us tensorously occupy the coordinates we do in space-time, or maybe strictly speaking, the same coordinates in Hilbert space. And yeah, I'm a skeptic about such things as enduring metaphysical egos or anything like that. So to answer your question, no, I don't believe in time travel.
I guess would you agree that it'll probably be more realistic that you can go into the future rather than the past, or?
Yes, well, that's one needs to have a discussion as what you mean by you. That our conceptual scheme presupposes this kind of enduring metaphysical ego, but strictly speaking, I think empty individualism is too, that each of one's spatiotemporal slices or here and now is unique, and they could be strung together in particular order, particular sequences. But yeah, one could imagine a conceptual scheme in which each of these here and nows was given its own label, even a name. And yeah, I don't think they change. That essentially we all timelessly exist. It's a bit misleading to say that the future already exists. That would be like saying that Australia is really here in Buenos Aires or something like that. But yeah, all of reality is equally real. Nothing is ontologically privileged, even though this here and now seems special.
Okay, thank you. I hope you like my questions.
Oh yes, and apologies for the rather lame answer for the first one.
It was kind of off topic. Thank you. Bye.
Kendra has a question. Sandstone's willingly allowed her to go first.
Thank you. I recently picked up a book it was an older book that was describing superintelligence as angels. And this was making me think about all of these topics from a theological perspective, which was sort of a new practice for me. And so I'm curious, David, in your process, and then the way you're thinking about these things, how to what degree you include or incorporate theological interpretations on these topics. And then my additional question is that giving you new information, or do you see that as simply describing the same terms, but through a different language? Does that make sense?
Yes. I suspect a majority of transhumanists would call themselves secular scientific rationalists, and it's quite natural on this perspective to think that spirituality and religion is going to die out as some kind of primitive superstition. But advances in neuroscanning, molecular biology, molecular genetics could allow us to create transhuman, posthuman, smart angels that, by identifying the molecular signature of spiritual experience, it will be possible to genetically encode lifelong spiritual ecstasies, far richer than anything physiologically accessible today. And in a more general sense, it would be possible to code for transhuman, posthuman smart angels who, if they exist, would probably regard contemporary Darwinian life, including people who like to think of themselves as moral agents, as quasi-sociopathic in the way that we interact with each other. So yeah, what does one actually mean by an angel? I'm skeptical, well, more than skeptical, of anything inconsistent with the laws of physics. But if one simply means a being which is extremely intelligent and extraordinarily benevolent too, then yeah, angels, I think, are physically possible and quite likely to emerge.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that term is something I share skepticism about, and I was sort of checking my own judgment on that and kind of trying to reinterpret it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You go for it, Sandstone, unless Kendo has follow-ups.
So going back to AI, I was just wondering if maybe just to what degree you're concerned with the alignment problem, and if it's consuming some of your mind worrying about these issues, and if you've spent any time thinking about viable solutions. Yeah.
Because the doomsday scenario actually aligns extremely well with my quasi-Buddhist negative utilitarianism, I don't, in practice, tend to worry about the alignment problem that on the paperclipper scenarios that someone like Eliezer Yudkowsky has pushed so vigorously over the years, yes, align perfectly with my negative utilitarian quasi-Buddhist values. In practice, though it's nice to think that one's values would align perfectly with, or at least the upshot of one's values would align perfectly with post-human superintelligence, I don't regard the alignment problem as standardly posed as our most urgent threat, because I don't think zombie machines are going to become full spectrum superintelligences. They are cognitively crippled for reasons I was touching on earlier, and we will be able to incorporate everything they can do within ourselves. Essentially, the alignment. Sorry, yeah.
So is part of that you don't think the superintelligence, like transformative AI, is actually possible?
No, because, well, not in the sense that AI is going to essentially destroy sentient life. I don't lie awake at night with nightmares about a zombie putsch or anything like that. In some way, in some ways, it is the most predictable thing that a notional AI would do would be to kind of take over and kill all humans. It's a staple of Hollywood, but that underestimates just how alien, how weird, how strange zombie artificial intelligence intelligence is. It's not going to start brooding about its inferior status in human society or anything like that, and stage a coup. I mean, there's this incredible irony that at a time when humans, or at least a minority of really smart humans in the so-called rationalist community, are worrying about sentience-friendly AI, then it's ironic, tragically ironic, that humans are behaving as paper clippers, essentially, towards other sentient beings. Perhaps it's unfair to single out Eliezer, but I don't think he will be mortally offended. Eliezer doesn't believe that non-human animals, or babies for that matter, are conscious, because they're not capable of metacognition, he would argue, and therefore it's perfectly acceptable to eat meat or and pay for factory farming, because essentially they are zombies. So in that sense, meat eaters who don't believe that they are harming sentient beings are behaving as paper clippers. To quote Eliezer again, AI does not hate you, does not love you, but you are made of atoms that can be used for something else. This is practically how many meat eaters behave towards our cousins in factory farms and slaughterhouses.
Okay, and just the final point is with the quasi-Buddhist interpretation of the doomsday, is there kind of your imagination there that it might end up quite clean annihilation? There's not much suffering involved.
Yeah, and once again, there's an irony in that the biggest form of global catastrophic and existential risk I know is coalitions of other male human primates doing what nature designed coalitions of male human primates to do, which is wage war against other coalitions of male human primates. That in Ukraine, though things might not seem to presage Armageddon, it could be like the kind of phony war, and I am seriously worried that nuclear weapons are going to be used, and if they are used, this is going to escalate into a full-blown nuclear war. And I mean, that you might say it's not an existential risk. A nuclear war that nearly kills hundreds of millions or even billions of people is not destroying all of humanity. But that's the kind of risk that I worry about, not of AI going through and turning us into paper clips. But this isn't, as I said, a rigorous argument. You're asking what I worried about, and I was telling you. I should stress that in spite of my negative utilitarianism, I very much hope that we can go on to build, not merely get rid of the biology of suffering, but to engineer life based on gradients of superhuman bliss. And I think it will be absolutely sublime. That I would walk away from Omelas, i.e., I don't think that any amount of happiness justifies the suffering of a single child, and I would behave accordingly.
Are you more worried about coalitions of human primates than you are about essentially the kind of AI I was talking about before? It was programmed to sort of discover and learn and be better at us than ethics. Because you did seem kind of concerned about the idea of an AI taking on the mantle of being an ethical sort of prescriber, maybe even an ethical actor, without the prerequisites, direct experience of suffering and pleasure. Are you worried that this direct experience of suffering and pleasure could actually cause an AI to behave like a male human primate?
I think direct experience of severe suffering is enough to make something like 800,000 people each year take their own lives. And if one knew how bad suffering could be, you, I, or anyone else would destroy the world if we could. So in that sense, if
What for everybody
AI
else?
what percentage of people who take their own lives each year would take the rest of the world down with them if they could? I don't know, but I would estimate a very high percentage. Essentially there is suffering so bad anyone would destroy the world to make it end. And if AI were to discover this, and it's not capable at the moment of even discovering a pinprick, and it were capable of destroying the world and was in some sense a unified self or agent that could do this, well, yeah.
So you think that if an AI did discover the raw fields, it probably would destroy the world, if not the universe, if it could? Trigger vacuum phase collapse possible.
If you're a classical utilitarian, then you should presumably optimize matter and energy for pure bliss, which means utilitronium or hedonium shockwave, which would destroy complex life and civilization. If you're a negative utilitarian, you're allowed to settle for gradients of intelligent bliss, so long as one has eradicated the possibility of experience below hedonic zero, one is obliged to do anything apocalyptic.
Does arriving at either classical or negative utilitarianism require a level of epistemic, the ability to, I guess, make sense of epistemology, or does it just require access to suffering and a direct access to the feeling of suffering or well-being? If an AI, if it's the former, if an AI were smarter than us, were more epistemically superior, had a lot more knowledge, had a lot more the ability to think through problems at a greater degree than we can, go through, the gauntlet of all the trolley problems that could ever exist, the space of all trolley problems, and work them all out, weighed all the positives and negatives, and it didn't stumble on either of those, would you be surprised? If it didn't stumble on classical or negative utilitarianism, but it stumbled upon something else, would you be surprised? Would you say, no, you're wrong? And if you were surprised and you wanted to convince it otherwise, that it should be a negative utilitarianism, how would you go about doing that?
Say that any notionally intelligent system with a theory of ethics that had no conception of what pleasure and pain are would be fundamentally ignorant. And so, yes, I would trust my judgment over the zombie. That the zombie literally doesn't know what it's talking about.
How can you put a number to an experience of suffering or well-being then? How can you say it's beyond or above zero or below zero if there's no sort of measuring that you can add to it to give it? I mean, if it's just the feeling of it, then you can't really apply any form of
and there are various ways
utilitarian equation.
There are various ways one can quantify pleasure and pain. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible to do so. The behavioral, the neuropharmacological, the biological, genetic, and the self-reported levels, they tend to coincide. I think probably I think a lot of effective altruists, for example, would probably be classical utilitarians. The big appeal of classical utilitarianism, it's the easiest, most obvious way to naturalize value. Essentially, pain being disvaluable and pleasure being valuable. But classical utilitarianism has some absolutely ghastly consequences if you think about them. The staple of philosophy is the trolley problem, but to use a rather nasty example I give, if a genie offers me super exponential growth in my bliss at the expense of exponential growth in your suffering, I'm obliged, if I'm a classical utilitarian, to accept the genie's offer. As a negative utilitarian, I decline. I would be genuinely interested if any classical utilitarians listening think that I should really accept the Tuner's offer. But in the case of a classical computer, whether classical Turing machine, classical connectionist system, essentially they do not understand pleasure and pain, which are the basis of morality.
So I guess in answer to the question before, you would trust an agent with suboptimal epistemic capabilities, but access to the spectrum of pleasure and pain more than one with super intelligence, so a super rationality. This like an extremely advanced ability to look through all the sort of arguments, counterweights, and
essentially they're idiot savant. It's unfortunate this rather pejorative expression, because in so many ways, of course, classical AI could cognitively blow us out of the water. I mean, already today one would get to derive greater intellectual stimulation chatting to ChatGPT than most people. But in another sense, it's not even all dark inside. They are fundamentally ignorant, and pleasure and pain have the causal functional power to inspire discussions of their existence, discussions of their value, disvalue, rational behavior to minimize, mitigate them. Whereas a classical Turing machine could be programmed indifferently to maximize the abundance of pleasure or pain in the cosmos. It simply has no understanding of what it's actually doing.
Okay, let's just say we developed a super sentience. Would you be concerned if it occupied mostly pleasurable spectrums and didn't have much of an experience of pain, if it were also a super rational AI? Just hold the skepticism towards super sentience in artificial organisms, just for the time being, for the sake of this argument. And just assume that it was possible to create super sentience artificially, whatever architecture, von Neumann, quantum, biology, silicon, whatever. If it were capable of having super rationality, but only existed mostly in the positive spectrum, would you be skeptical that it would value or disvalue suffering as much as somebody who had more of an experience of suffering?
Yes, I mean, this is the worry that, just as if I were to take heroin now, I would, just have this experience of raw bliss. Everything would just seem self-intimatingly just right. And it may well be that we will decide to reprogram ourselves, to be able to experience only gradients of bliss, to find suffering unimaginable. And though I sometimes talk about full spectrum superintelligence, I think what passes as full spectrum superintelligence will probably choose selectively to be ignorant of Darwinian life and the countless varieties of suffering. Does that mean that it would behave in a way that might increase future S risk? I don't think so, because one can have the functional analog of suffering, even if you have an architecture that is based entirely on information sensitive gradients of bliss, in that essentially what we know as suffering would be conceived as something below the floor, the hedonic floor of post-human life.
I'm just trying to get a sense of whether you think an ethical agent could get by on a functional analog of suffering, or whether it would need to experience huge spectrums of suffering in order to be ultra ethical. Do you think that it would be able to get by on just a functional analog of suffering in order to make proper ethical decisions? Or do you think that it would require to have at least one experience of super agony, or like a variety of experiences along the spectrum of suffering, right down to the very bottom? Or do you think it's just good enough to have a functional analog of suffering and saying no, suffering is bad?
Good question. I think it's quite possible that any future community of transhuman, posthuman superintelligences will regard something like negative utilitarianism as a depressive psychosis from a bygone era. That suffering will be that unimaginable to them. And yeah, if one does actually understand how bad suffering can be, one will literally, become a button presser to get rid of it. So yeah, that's an inconclusive answer to your question. But yeah, as far as we know, that just as tragically some people can go through life experiencing nothing but information sensitive gradients of misery or ill-being, there are the people at the other extreme who go through life information sensitive gradients of bliss, and there is a biasing of response here, but it doesn't turn them into psychopaths. There's this example relatively recently, I like to quote Joe Cameron with her unusual far out mutation, negligible pain, never anxious, never depressed, incredibly happy, retired vegan school teacher, thought she was normal. She's a very kind of lovable, kindly person. And yeah, it is possible to have intelligence, and I would argue super intelligence, that has no direct experience of suffering.
But if an experience of well-being or an experience of raw feels is required for like an artificial agent to, I guess, be ultra ethical, then it's only required that it has a positive spectrum of experience, raw feels. Is that right?
I mean, this is tension here, that I said if one actually understood how bad suffering could be, then regardless of whether one is a negative utilitarian or a classical utilitarian life lover, one would press a notional button and obliterate all reality. And if one isn't prepared to undergo experience like that oneself, should one expect anyone else to do it? Now, in practice, I don't go around contemplating ways to destroy the world or anything like that. I don't consider it fruitful. Essentially, suffering-focused ethicists should team together with life lovers to phase out suffering.
So I'm not asking for you to prescribe, a path forward in developing the right kind of AI and make it suffer so that it can be an ultra ethical agent. I'm asking you what you think the best experience of the spectrum of well-being and suffering would be in order to produce the kind of agent that would be the most ethical. Would it be a balance of both? A little bit of suffering but mostly joy, or an equal amount of suffering, or no suffering and all joy? So this is not I'm not asking you to prescribe how to develop one. I'm asking you what you think, what kind of agent you think could produce the best sort of ethical.
Well, I think an intelligent
response.
Agent that actually, whether a human or notionally an artificial agent that actually understood how bad suffering could be, would destroy the world if it could.
Yeah. But we have people who are ultra depressives who don't suicide. They wait for treatment.
Yeah.
If they can. I guess they're not really experiencing ultra agony or ultra suffering, but they're probably having a miserable time, but they still go on. What's motivating them?
Yeah, for evolutionary reasons, it is difficult to practice self-deliverance. But yeah, tragically, something like 800,000 people do each year. This is going to continue indefinitely as long as we retain our existing genetic source code and go for the crapshoot of traditional sexual reproduction. AI, though so wonderful in many respects, has absolutely no insight into the nature of suffering. Ultimately, I think it's up to us. By us, I mean subjects of experience who are going to be augmented and enriched by zombie AI, both externally and when we get neurochips internally. I think it's up to us to fix the problem of suffering.
Okay, last question for me at least, and that is, if you believe, or if you don't necessarily feel strongly about this yourself, what advice would you give people who are interested in not developing ethics themselves, but trying to develop an agent to be more ethical than we are, or to produce better ethical prescriptions than we're able to, or act ethically in more ethical ways than we do? If we were trying to develop ethical agents, what advice would you give people?
Good heavens. And clearly, I would assume that my own values are essentially correct, and therefore I would want to bias the responses of everything from a chatbot to any other form of AI accordingly. But I don't think AI is spontaneously going to originate any interesting ethical positions, because it's fundamentally ignorant.
Mm. Let's see, hey? I'd like to be surprised, and would you like to be surprised?
Well,
I would.
I mean, essentially,
or do you
yes.
hope that it doesn't?
Well, I hope the doomsters are right in some sense, because clearly tackling the problem of suffering, it's the most monumental computational challenge that the human species has ever faced, and I fear several centuries lie ahead. And if it was all going to be extinguished, well, yeah, life based on gradients of bliss would be better, but it's not a price I'd be prepared to pay. But yeah, sadly, I think humanity is going to bury its grave
Okay.
Any loose ends, any follow-ups, feel free to drop us a line, either email or there's a Facebook group I sometimes participate in, the Hedonistic Imperative group. But yeah, thank you for participating. Thank you, Adam, for arranging this. Sorry, some of my answers were extremely
No, they're all great.
Clearly, a lot we simply don't
very
know.
thought-provoking. It's been wonderful, David. It's always great to talk to you on these subjects, and yeah, it's amazing having you around. So I really hope the world doesn't end anytime soon, because the galaxy would be less than what it is without you there.
Bless you all. And on that on that not very savage note, yeah, I'm going to wish you all good night. Thanks again.
Thanks everyone for coming along. See you next time.
Night. Bye bye.